Hello everyone, it's Rio Cloud Sync. Today we're going to be looking at the Microsoft End User Computing Choices, EUC in brackets. There are two options. We've got Cloud PC and we've got Cloud VDI. Cloud PC is a software as a service. It sits as Windows 365 underneath the Endpoint Manager console within the Microsoft Intune suite. And this is a software as a service. This is fully managed by Microsoft themselves. The second solution is Cloud VDI, which was formerly known as Windows Virtual Desktop and now Azure Virtual Desktop. This is an infrastructure as a service, and we're looking to the shared responsibility model. There is much more Microsoft manage and much more you manage in terms of Cloud VDI. In terms of the virtual desktop choices, if you're looking for a desktop as a service solution, you're most likely looking at a software as a service, which is Windows 365. It comes in two different packages, both business and enterprise. Business for more of an out-of-box experience, simplified configuration and deployment, and also simplicity coinciding with end user experience. There's also a package for enterprise, which is a fully unified endpoint management solution. It comes with the integration of virtual networks, the added layer of security, with the association of zero trust topologies. When we look at Azure Virtual Desktop as an infrastructure as a service, you have full control with the Cloud VDI platform, as well as more responsibility as you're managing the deployment of remote apps, streaming, the multi-session and non-persistent desktops, as well as the integration with FS Logics as a Roman profile. You get to set where the data resides through the regions itself, i.e. UK South for one, and low usage scenarios. There are also some billing differences between the two solutions. One as a pay-as-you-go method, pay per user, and one more on a consumption model. In terms of the virtual desktop choices, here is the comparison chart from a high-level perspective. From Windows 365 perspective, you have the native capability to deploy Windows 10 and Windows 11 personalized desktops. You can license the user as per the device you want to deploy to that Z user through the CPU all the way to the RAM and SSD storage mount. It's a complete end-to-end Microsoft service of which they will manage all the security patching, the configuration on your behalf is deployed through a centralized console, and it's predictable per user pricing. So you'll be able to see the amount that the SKU is of which you're deploying, and you'll be able to have that analytics and that pricing overview behind it to understand the amount you're going to be getting billed every month. In terms of Cloud VDI, this is optimized for more flexibility. It's based on flexible consumption, just like any other Azure resources in terms of deployment. It's a custom managed infrastructure platform. As I said, it's infrastructure as a service, so you will manage a majority of the service. There will be a few bits Microsoft do manage, but that could be looked at in a bit more depth in terms of the shared responsibility model. And you have the flexibility of deploying Windows 10, Windows 11, or Windows Server multi-session desktops. Considerations for which model? We're alluding back again to the pricing models. So Windows 365 is per user per month, so you understand how much you're going to get billed every month. Azure Virtual Desktop is consumption based. Okay, so how much you use at any given time. Is it in a on state or is it deallocated, for example? If it's deallocated, you're going to stop the consumption, but then the burden of the storage still remains. Okay, so depending on the use case, the business scenario, justification behind it will be depending on what model you look at. IT skills and experience. If you're used to the Endpoint Manager console, so Microsoft Intune as a service, then it may be you're more inclined to look at Windows 365. However, if you've touched base with Microsoft Azure Management Portal prior, You understand the usual deployment prerequisites, i.e. region, resource group, subscription, especially the billing mechanism in terms of cost analysis. Then you may look at Azure as a solution and Azure Virtual Desktop. In terms of what components you're required to manage, here is kind of the shared responsibility model in terms of customer in the blue, Microsoft in the grey. Okay, and you can see there's a clear difference or a clear indicator in terms of what you manage in comparison to Microsoft for the two different solutions. On the left in the blue box, you've got AVD. On the right, you've got Windows 365. You manage more on the left, you manage less on the right. Okay. So let's go through to the prerequisites and deployment for AVD. This is just going to be a high-level deployment. So in terms of the prerequisites for AVD, at a high level, you need an active Azure subscription or an Azure plan, depending on the model and how you're acquiring a service. You need the identity provider, which can be found in the screenshot listed on the right. Okay, click on subscriptions, you click on resource provider in the left-hand pane, and you type in Microsoft.desktop virtualization. If that appears, great. If not, search it, it'll be grayed out, and just register the provider. Support operating system, the appropriate license. So with AVD, it is normally Microsoft Business Premium at a minimum. Network connectivity and remote desktop client. Remote desktop client has to be an approved desktop client for the AVD solution itself, which we will cover in more detail. In terms of the supported identity scenarios, you've got Azure AD with Active Directory Domain Services and Azure AD with Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Depending on the on your business stance, the deployment methods, the in-house skill you have will be dependent on the scenario, and you may only use the AD Domain Services if you're using the likes of FS Logics as a Roman profile for persistent desktops. I'm not going to touch too much on FS Logics. I just want to get past the high level deployment of AVD as a solution. However, here's some high level documentation on it. You will need Azure Files or Azure Storage account as a backend for the profiles to reside. In terms of the operating system and licenses, like I said, you can deploy servers, you can deploy Windows 10 Enterprise to Windows 11 Enterprise, both multi-session as well. So if you do have a pool scenario where multiple users are accessing one given VDI machine, that is possible, and with the likes of load balancing as well. On the right, you have the licensing prerequisites. Minimum prerequisite is Business Premium. You can also license it with Windows Enterprise E3 and E5. And if you're looking at licensing it through a server model, there are the relevant RDS CALs available on a per user or per device basis. If you're deploying existing devices, so existing virtual machines to a already or existing host pool, there are methods of doing so. Okay, you can deploy an existing VDI through the host pool setup itself, of which you can select the virtual machine. Manually in the Azure portal, you can add it after you've created the host pool, either via the UI or via PowerShell itself. Okay, from a high level perspective, it's just downloading a registry key, running a extension on the machine, and entering the registration key, and it will pull the VDI into the host pool itself. Networking requirements. Okay, it must be your virtual network must be in the same Azure region as the session host. Okay, the Azure Virtual Desktop does establish a reverse connection. Okay, so you won't need to open the ports 3389, for example, and expose that to the public internet or public domain. The virtual networks do need line of sight with domain controllers. So if you are using the likes of AD Domain Services or Azure AD Domain Services, and as per what I've already said, you don't need to open up the port 3389. You can use a vast number of clients, AVD client, Azure Virtual Desktop Store for app Windows, web client, Mac OS client, iOS, Android, remote desktop for app for Windows. The remote desktop connection MSTSC client isn't supported. In terms of deployment, you can create host pools in the following Azure regions. They're listed down the left-hand side. For our example, we will be deploying the service in UK South because that's where we do reside physically. This does reduce latency and bandwidth across the service. So just make sure the location you are selecting is relevant to your actual physical location, and it's applicable for your GDPR regulations. Okay. From a high level perspective, we just need to access portal.azure.com, type in Azure Virtual Desktop, and once we've got that resource provider registered, we can open up the service itself. You'll see a high level dashboard, and down the left hand side you'll have your manage bar as well as your monitoring bar. Your manage bar is where you will create your host pools, application groups, and workspaces. So first things first, let's create a virtual network. The session hosts, which are virtual machines in AVD terms, need to be able to connect to the internet. How do they connect to the internet? Via a virtual network. So if we just create an out-of-box virtual network, it just needs to have one subnet associated with the virtual network itself, and we'll just make sure that the two VDIs are joined to this one VNet. So we're going to first select the subscription, which is technical pre-sales. We're going to create a resource group. We're just going to call this AVD from a consolidation perspective. We're going to name this AVD Virtual Network, and it's going to reside in the UK South region. We're going to configure the IPv4 address. As I said, the range itself just needs to be default range, /16, and the default subnet can stay the same with /24. That's fine. Leave the security tab. Its default configuration. Bastion host can be configured if you do want to access it through a more secure means. However, you will need to create a new subnet for that, which will need to be named Azure Bastion subnet. DDoS protection and firewall, just keep the same. Validate the configuration and create a resource. That leads us on to creating a host pool. Okay, so we'll select the subscription, we'll select the same resource group, we'll give it a host pool name, which we're going to call it host pool 01. Location UK South, this is where the metadata will be stored, and make sure we comply with GDPR regulations. Validation environment is where updates will be pre-released to. However, this host pool will be in prod from day one, and we don't want any service release updates pushed to this host pool itself, so we'll just select this as no. Preferred app group type, it's either going to be a remote app or it's going to be a desktop. In this case, we're going to deploy desktops. We're not deploying single app instances, so we'll select desktop itself. We want a fully virtualized multi-session enterprise OS desktop. We're going to select the host pool type. Host pool type is going to be pooled. So we select host pool type pooled. Pooled means the users won't have a persistent desktop. They will be given any desktop which is available at any given time. We can make it static, so the user is assigned one given desktop. However, in this instance, we're just going to create a pooled host pool type. The load balancing algorithm is going to be breadth first. So they will be spread across the machines itself. There is another option for depth first, which is all users will be given the one desktop until that desktop is maxed out, and then they'll be distributed to the next available desktop. So the workload is balanced across all the given VDIs itself. And we'll select the max session limit to 5. We'll create a session host itself. So alluding back to the slide where we said we can bring existing VDIs into a host pool. In this instance, we'll create a session host. virtual machine while we're creating the host pool. So we'll select yes. We'll give it we'll deploy it to the same resource group. We'll give it a name prefix of AAD-HP01. Location is going to stay the same. No redundancy required in this case. We don't need any locally redundant services at all, or geo-redundant. Security type standard. I'll give it a Windows 11 Enterprise multi-session plus the M365 apps for install. This could be a standard D2 V3 machine because we are on a consumption model and we want to keep cost to a minimum. We're going to deploy two VMs. Okay, so 2 session hosts, and they're both going to have this configuration. Because we want the simplicity and the speed and the efficiency with the VDIs, we're going to install we're going to attach a premium SSD disk. Boot diagnostics disabled. We don't need to see what's going on in the machine at this point in time. We're going to associate the host pool to the virtual network we created earlier. Okay. And we're going to select the directory in terms of identity management to Azure AD. As I said, if you are using the likes of FS Logics, you will need to connect it to AD domain services or Azure Active Directory domain services. And we're going to give it a local username and password. We're going to create an application group, which is going to be the desktop itself. So this will be the fully pledged desktop which users can access. And we will need to associate this with a workspace so that the users can select the workspace as and when they RDP on to the machine. Once we've validated the deployment configuration and created the resources, we then need to amend the RDP properties. As my machine itself is not joined to this domain for this Microsoft organizational tenant, we need to add a RDP property which is target to AAD joined :I:1. This allows non-Azure AD domain joined devices to remote onto the host point session host itself. In terms of connecting to the session host, we can use either web client or desktop client. Either one will just subscribe to the URL. That will federate against our Azure AD credentials, which in return will bring the workspace and provide us the desktop and the remote app if you've deployed a remote app. This is the end goal, connecting via the web client in this instance, and you can see I've got a fully pledged desktop to work with. Now we'll look at Windows 365 as a solution. So there are 2 types of Windows 365 solutions. We've got Windows 365 Business and Windows 365 for Enterprise. Windows 365 for Business is made specifically to use in smaller companies, up to 300 seats. Okay. And the use of Windows 365 is more for simplicity and out of the box. Windows 365 Enterprise is for larger companies who want unlimited seats for creating cloud PCs. It also includes the options to create custom cloud PCs based on device images that you create, and integration with Endpoint Manager as well as virtual networks with Azure Management. Before starting to make your or deploying your Windows 365 solution, you need to open up portal.azure.com, go into Azure Active Directory, and make sure under device settings users are able to join devices to Azure AD. There are no licensing dependencies. You purchase the machine size through the marketplace itself, and then you assign the appropriate user account to the device. In terms of deployment, you license the user itself with either with one of the Windows 365 business SKUs. In return, they can access windows365.microsoft.com, and you'll see a machine appear which will be in a provisioning state. Cloud PC is ready at this point. They can then log in using their Azure AD credentials. They then have a personal desktop to work with.